baseball information and fantasy gambling information overlap. I'm Joe Duffy, CEO of OffshoreInsiders.com. And number one, yes, that is where they do overlap as far as the information sources. I remember when this internet first came around, Roto News, which begat Roto Wire, was one of my absolute best sources for baseball gambling information. Now, over the years, it's kind of varied, but ESPN Fantasy Daily Notes now does a tremendous job with stuff that's really of interest to the gambler as well as a fantasy player. It's, in theory, written for the fantasy player who can change his lineup each and every day, the head-to-head competition, and great notes there for the fantasy player. And again, I find that is the case in football and somewhat in basketball as well. I know that at times I sound like I'm a shill for the worldwide leader or the four-letter evil empire, depending on which standpoint you want to come from. But I'm just telling you, folks, ESPN, they are the worldwide leader for one reason, and that is because they are the best. And I do enjoy the fantasy baseball news and notes. In particular, says how pitchers match up versus that night's opponent and what hitters have hit them the best, etc., etc. Excellent stuff for the gambler. Now, what is playing fantasy baseball? And I don't really play it anymore. Actually, I don't play it anymore. There's not really playing anymore. It's like being not really pregnant. Either are you aren't. I did give up playing fantasy baseball because, my rooting interest overlapped and it got around to the point I wasn't even paying attention to my fantasy baseball lineup. But that is not to say that there wasn't some tremendous learning experience that I got from that. And what I really taught me more, not that I didn't know it per se, but it truly brought it to the forefront. And I've always said probably the single biggest mistake that gamblers make is they overanalyze pitching when it comes to baseball handicapping. Playing fantasy baseball, it certainly taught me that pitching is the biggest variable. Batting is more of a constant. For example, let's just say we arrange, a blue ribbon panel, the ultimate baseball experts, and at the end of the year, they came up with, you pick the number, top 10, top 20, top 50 biggest disappointments, and the equal number of surprises throughout the year. Well, I will flat out tell you, every single solitary year, without exception, every single solitary year, a disproportionate number is going to be starting pitching, and to a lesser extent, just pitching in general, but especially the starting pitching. Well, that is one of the reasons why we have actually weighed baseball pitching much less over the years and more handicapping. Why? Well, the odds maker makes the odds based on pitching much more than it does on they do on offense. When they zig, you got to zag. And that is one of the reasons why we've been able to find bad lines. Again, another one of our golden rules. A lot of gamblers think, I can't bet on this team. They're way too inconsistent. I just can't figure this team out. Wrong. Gamblers the odds makers and the bookmakers despise uncertainty. Therefore, uncertainty is the enemy of the odds makers. And anything that is the enemy of the odds makers is the friend of the professional gambler. And with pitching being such a variable, if you handicap the more true thing, the much easier part of the game to predict, which is offense, you are going to find a lot of offlines. And that's another one of our golden rules. Too many people think they have to win this one particular game. In reality, you just want to be able to win a much higher percentage of your bets. In baseball, it obviously varies based on the money line. When you're picking against the spread on a 10% line, the number is 52.9%, I believe it is, that you have to pick. But in our baseball, where we pick predominantly underdogs and small favorites, we can hit 50% of our plays and still win, and that is the key. Losing, quite frankly, is the cost of doing business. We're going to lose 45% of our plays in baseball, where we pick a bunch of underdogs and small favorites. We're going to lose about 40% of our plays in the against the spread handicapping, but that is fine. There are no sure things. The key is to find the higher percentage, and that's where you are going to find some bad lines, some cases where a team maybe should be a small favorite and they're a large underdog, and that is by focusing more on the constant, which is on offense. Now, what are the differences between fantasy baseball knowledge and gambling knowledge? Well, fantasy is obviously a lot more about long term. You want to pick up guys that may not have a good next week for you, but are going to have a good year for you. And of course, if you're in one of the keeper leagues, you want to pick up a good young player who 2-3 years down the road is going to do you some good. So in baseball, for example, or in baseball gambling, I should say, you want to, for example, ride the hot pitchers. Dylan Gee is going to be a lot more valuable to the gambler short term, probably than he is going to be to the fantasy player long term. Got a long list of guys that came up from the minor leagues, got the hot hand for a while, and then were never heard from again. Some of my favorite guys, Pat Rapp, John Schneider was a guy for the Chicago White Sox, and like his first 10 starts, I think he was an underdog in most of the games. I'm doing this off the top of my head. I didn't actually look up his exact stats, but he's somebody that we made a lot of money on, 10, 11 starts by riding him when he was so undervalued. And you know what? He turned out to not be a very good pitcher after all, but that's fine. He's a perfect example, and Pat Rapp's another guy that we mentioned that you may not want to jump on a guy in your fantasy league, but ride them while they are in a groove, certainly in the major leagues. And that's another thing where the fantasy baseball, they have pretty good scouting reports on pitchers coming up from the minor leagues. Now, as a general rule of thumb, true, quote-unquote, can't-miss prospects are going to be brought up by major league teams when they feel they are ready for the majors, as opposed to some of the so-so prospects, the guys that aren't quite can't-miss, they are brought up maybe when they're red hot and a team has an opening. For example, if a team, their number 2 starter goes down, they got to bring up from a guy from the minor leagues. They won't necessarily bring up the top prospect. They're going to bring up the guy who is pitching the hottest. So that is why looking at the last 3 or 4 starts in the minor leagues can be very key to the gambler. It may not be as important to the fantasy player who's looking more at long-term stuff. Our Canadian crew, I'll be honest with you, if anything, as far as using fantasy information to utilize in winning gambling, they're probably the best in the business. Yes, me, Joe Duffy, and my God's Tips, we are the best overall in the business. But as far as really exploiting fantasy baseball and football information, where they are incredible in both sports. I know most of the crew members, they play in high-stakes fantasy leagues, and they're tremendous at that. And I really admire what they've done with their knowledge of the game. They pick it up from fantasy, and it overlaps in their gambling. But again, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some differences in fantasy information and betting information, and the key is to know the difference. Certainly as football season approaches, we'll do a podcast where we talk a little bit more about fantasy football, and maybe I'll reminisce how I really miss those days where years ago there's this footballinjuries.com, and it's no longer, they were actually sold to another company because it was run by that Adam Cohen, and the other guy, they kind of split apart, and they got their jobs with CBS Sportsline and NFL Network. So they got higher paying jobs. But there was at one time where their fantasy football injuries, they would do day of injuries, and you could beat the screen. And used to make a lot of money being ahead of the screen and anticipating middles. But that's for another podcast. But again, fantasy baseball sites are very valuable for the gambler, but you have to know the difference in how to use fantasy information and gambling information. And hopefully I gave you a pretty good primer at that. So again, visit us at offshoreinsiders.com, www.offshoreinsiders.com for the best sports betting information.